Well, we're going to try to save some time. I'm going to run over this sort of real fast for those who was not here this morning. Talking about Matthew 24, where people try to teach the rapture, earthly reign of Jesus. They think that Matthew 24 is all about the end of time, and they try to tie it into that by twisting scriptures around. Here was a man, Herbert W. Armstrong, a Worldwide Church of God. He predicted in 36 that it would be, but after that he had to change that 3 more times, and he still missed it. Here's Charles T. Russell, a man that established the Jehovah's Witness, said it would happen in 41. Well, here we are. We're still here. Jerry Falwell said January 2000, this is where at Tim Leahy and a whole bunch of people thought that it was going to happen, and guess what? We're still here. Even to this feller there that I just took off for, John Hagee. He was in on that blood moon prophecy. That ain't been but a few years ago. Well, 14 and 15. And so you can still see that we're still here. Here is people that are trying to predict something and try to bring a date on something that the Bible said that the angels didn't know, that nobody knowed except the Father. David Meade predicted here just the other day that this planet X here at Nibiru, however how you say that it would actually take it out. So here we look at Matthew chapter 24. We find that there's 3 questions in this chapter asked. About when would the destruction of Jerusalem happen, when would be the time of Jesus' coming, and the end of the age. And Jesus begins to answer these by showing them this great temple. Here, as we said, you look at that and you see what parts of it that he was talking about there. This is, and maybe I should have pointed this out this morning. When you look at this area right here, this was the outer court. This is where Gentiles would be allowed. This right in here would be where the women would be allowed. But only in here would the priests go. So you had the outer court and the court for the women, and then if you remember in Acts, Paul gets in trouble because they think that he took Timothy into the temple. They actually, what they thought was that Paul took Timothy back in here, being uncircumcised. But he didn't. But that's what Jesus is talking about, and he's looking at that place and explaining them and showing them what was going to happen to it. Right there is what stands in the place today, is that right there. And you can see it at a far distance, and you can see part of the old wall that runs through there. That's the outer wall. That's not the temple itself. That big old dome thing right there sits where the temple was at. So when Jesus is talking about the destruction and not one stone left upon another, he's talking about that very temple that's sitting here. Here's the holiest of holy places for the Jews. This is the wall of Wailing. This is the west wall. They go there, as we said this morning, to put slits of papers in it with prayers on it. Now here's the 3 questions. Tell us, the disciples asked him, tell us about these things. When the overthrow of the temple is going to be. What will be the signs of thy coming? What will be the signs of this? And what will be the ends of the world? So Jesus begins to answer these as we go down through here. Jesus tells them, don't let nobody deceive you. You know, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. Well, we've seen in Acts chapter 11 that they were wars. Jesus said the one that continued to the end would be saved. We showed that prophetic language can have 2 different meanings. Just like when God said to Adam and Eve, in the day you eat of this tree, you shall surely die. But Adam didn't die right there. He suffered a death, a separation from God. But really the fulfillment of what God was talking about is when he literally died. We talked about the gospel of the kingdom being preached, and this is sort of where I got in trouble this morning. But think about it. He says, and the gospel of this kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto the nations, and then shall the end come. Well, we find Jesus given a great commission to the disciples in Mark 16, verse 15 through 20. You find it again in Matthew chapter 28. You find it again in Luke chapter 24. But the ideal here was there to go into all the world and take the gospel into all the world. All right, we know on the day of Pentecost, they preached actually to the Jews on the day of Pentecost. We find out in Acts chapter 10 that Peter takes the gospel to Cornelius, the Gentile world. That was the idea of taking the gospel into all the world, that God said, look, before the end of Jerusalem, the gospel is going to be preached to all nations. And we know the nations was the Jews and the Gentiles. That's the way they looked at it. They wasn't no such thing as Oriental, Hispanic, or anything like that. It was either you was Jew or Gentile. That's what you were. And that's the way they looked at it. So that gospel was taken all the way to them. Now, we can prove that by the Bible. Look at Psalms here and what the Bible talks about this day and time. Their line is gone out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them has he set a tabernacle for the sun. This is talking about the preaching of the gospel. Look again, Romans chapter 10 and verse 18. But I say, have they not heard? Yes, verily, their sound went into all the earth, and their words into the ends of the world. Had the Jews heard about the gospel? Sure they had. By this time, had the Gentiles heard about the gospel? Sure they had. Did the Jews? Well, some Jews did. Not all Jews turned it down, but as a whole, the Jews did. As we pointed out this morning, Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not. But to as many as would receive him, he gave them powers to become sons. That's in John chapter 1. Again, we look at Acts chapter 10, we see there that Cornelius and his family and household, they obeyed the gospel. The gospel was brought to the Gentiles. So truly their voice was heard throughout the world. The known world to them. Again, look at the first chapter of Galatians here. Which is common to you as it is all the world, and bringeth forth fruits as it doeth also in you, since the day ye heard of it, and knew the grace of God in truth. Which come unto you, as it is in all the world. This is inspired men of God saying, look, we've took the gospel. Now this don't mean that each individual has heard the gospel. But what he is saying is that gospel is made known throughout the known world. It has been made known among the Gentiles. It has been made known among the Jews. And this gospel was spreading like wildfire. Again, look at Galatians chapter 1, verse 23. If you continue in the faith, grounded and settle and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, where I, Paul, am made a minister. Paul said he had preached it to everybody. Had not Paul preached it to the Jews? Sure he had, because every time he'd preach it to the Jews, he would get in trouble. So again, what Jesus is teaching them in Matthew 24 when he says this gospel in verse 14 has to be preached to among all people. Jesus is saying the gospel has got a duration to run here before the end of Jerusalem falls. The gospel is going to be preached. Everybody's going to have their opportunity. The Jews are going to have their opportunity. The Gentiles are going to have their opportunity. But when that is accomplished, then Jerusalem is not going to be. It's just not going to be no more. Now you think about that. Again, when the gospel is preached unto all the world, Jesus said, then shall come the end. But he's talking about the Jewish state, the destruction of the temple. Why? How can you know that? Well, look what Paul says. Do you believe Paul's saying the truth? Do you believe Paul's preaching the truth here? Paul is speaking by inspired word, he says that the gospel had been preached to every creature which is under heaven. When Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, that had in focus Jew and Gentile. They may have not have understood that, but that's what the focus of it was at the appropriate time. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. The gospel of the kingdom, the gospel was preached throughout the known world by AD 70. Everybody knew it. We're studying it. We see how the Gentiles was brought into it. Some of the Bible talks about them being grafted in. Some of the scriptures talk about Jerusalem being rejected because of their unbelief so that the Gentiles could be brought in. Daniel talks about when the sin is fully completed, and what Daniel is talking about there is when the full rejection of Jesus is come. Then the Jewish state is going to cease. Well, Jesus come, and they fully rejected him. And now they're going to be brought to an end. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about when the last gospel sermon is preached to the last person that's never had it. That's going to be pretty hard to do since we're having people born in this world all the time. So he's talking about in the Jew and Gentile. And then the end's going to come. The Jewish state, it's going to come to a close. Now, from Matthew 24 and verse 15 through 26, I want you to notice here how that Jesus is speaking to these. Now, you remember the disciples said, now we want to know the signs. What is going to be some of the signs that we can look for? Now, here's where people get the signs mixed up. People begin to look at these signs and they try to tie them to the end of the world. But these signs is not given to the end of the world, but to the end of the Jewish state. That's what Jesus is talking about. Now, remember their question. When shall these things be? What is the sign? And the end of the age. Now here we're going to start seeing Jesus sort of show them the signs to be looking for. So here's one thing that Jesus tells them. When ye therefore shall see the abomination and desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. What did Daniel talk about this? Daniel talks about 70 weeks. And he talks about something that stands in the holy place. Now remember, when we look at that temple, we have the two outer courts for the Gentiles, the inner court for the women, and then we had the place for the priest and the high priest back here. That's where they went to do their work. The holy priest only in the Holy of Holies. So again, he says, when you see that abomination standing there, what was going to be that abomination? What was it going to be? Well, the Bible's pretty clear on it if we just look for the answer. Look again. Abomination and desolation of Daniel was the Roman army. That was who was going to be standing in that holy place. Why would this be a desolation to it? Well, Roman soldiers is not Jews, first of all. But they were something else that also was there. It is what the Roman soldiers believed and how that they dressed and everything that they stood for that was going to be abomination to that. Again, look at how Mark words it. But when ye shall see the abomination, desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing where they ought not, let him that readeth understand, then let them that be in Judah flee unto the mountains. Now wait a minute. If this is talking about the end of time, what purpose would they be in running away? I mean, do you think you can outrun? You know, I'll tell you a fella who thought he could outrun God. Jonah. Jonah thought he could outrun God. If you think of the story of Jonah, he thought he could outrun God. God brought him back to the dry land in the belly of the whale, didn't he? Let him know real fast, you can't go. David said, you know, if I took wings of an eagle and flew to the ends of the earth, you're there. If I go to the depths of hell, you're there. We can't get away from God. So if it's the end of the world, right right there's just that verse a feller could look at and say, no, this couldn't be that. Again, look at Luke here. And Luke answers it real well. Luke says this in 21:20. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed about with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Now he's saying, look, when you see this, here's signs. Here's signs of the destruction of Jerusalem. Not the destruction of the world. It's destruction of Jerusalem. It's the destruction of that temple. It is the destruction of the Jewish religion. There are going to be things that really happens when this falls, and we'll talk about them as we go on. But what was this so desolate an abomination to God? You see these? That's a Roman shield. Do you recognize those wings? That's eagle's wings. That's what they had on their breastplates, and this is what they had on their shield. A lot of them that packed staffs had them certain things on their. That's what they worshipped. Some of them even had their emperor's name on it. That's what they worshiped. That's what they served. They served the emperor. They didn't serve God. They wasn't there for God. They were there to take over and to destroy this place. Here's what a Roman soldier would have looked at that time, looked like. And there would have been his shields that he's packing. That's what he would look like. Now Daniel is saying, now when you see this standing in the holy place, it's time for you to take off. Don't wait around. Don't wait around, and we'll see verses that are alluding to that fact. Don't hang around here. Don't wait around here to see what's going to happen. You get out. You get out, and you get out in a hurry. Now, truly, we can't show pictures of the true tabernacle or the temple being fallen, but think of it just about like it right there, because it is totally destroyed. It is totally destroyed. Not one block, and you can look at it on the internet today, you can't even tell it was ever there. That magnificent building, and look at all the things that you got standing over these columns that just stands out in nowhere that you look like you just walk up and put your hand on it, they just tumble over. They stood there for thousands of years. And here was this mighty temple of God that you can't find one rock of it. Not a piece of it. There's nothing there except that old big dome thing now. That is the destruction of that temple. These Gentile or these Roman soldiers in him. Now, when you look at history, and you have to look at history for this, the thing that they say that they did, they took in unclean animals, such as pigs and dogs and stuff, and they killed them on the altar, and they sacrificed them on the altar. Don't you know that a dog was unclean to a Jew? A pig was unclean. That would have been the lowest form of a degrade to them. But that's what these soldiers did. Because that's what they were there for, was to destroy it. And by doing so, they could show to the world that there's nothing about this. There's nothing about it. Let's just polish it off. Now I'm going to show you something about a religion that once was a true religion. Yes, corrupted, but yet nevertheless it was what God would have them to do, not the corrupt part. But we can turn on the other cheek and say, look at the church now itself. Look at the church in the Dark Ages. How that it was trying to be destroyed. How Paul himself tried to destroy it. How that down through the years it was tried to be destroyed by men. And yet it won every battle without raising a gun, without raising a sword. It won every battle. You know why? Because it's the people of God. It's God's people. Now when I say church, I'm talking about the church you find in the Bible, the Church of Christ. Now does that mean they're all right? No, because some of them has went the ways. At one time, this would have never happened to Israel if Israel had been doing God's will. But you see, these people had turned and they had rejected their Messiah. And this is why that God had him. Now, I want to look down through a few verses here. I'm not going to try to read all these, because if I do, I'm going to try to run out of time. So I'm just going to let you sort of scan down through our with me. Verse 16, let them that is in Judea flee unto the mountains. Verse 17, those on the housetop don't go down and take anything out of the house. Neither him that is in the field turn back to the house to take clothes. Woe unto them with children, and to them that give suck in those days. Pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath. Now wait a minute. Again, if these are referring to the end of time, why would this section here be put right in the middle of it? Jesus is telling them, here's the signs, and when you see the signs, here's what you need to do. When you see this, that Daniel is speaking about these soldiers in that temple where they should not be, and Jerusalem getting surrounded by these soldiers, he said, there is the time to make your escape. Because when they get it surrounded and get it pinned down, there's no escape. There's no way to get out. So you're to flee from her. Now, this is history. But history has it that not a Christian died in that. Why? Because they heeded the warning. To the Jews, this was just nothing. If it's the end of time, why would a woman with children or a woman giving suck in those days, why would that matter? Do you think when God comes, when Jesus comes, when the end of time is going to be no longer, do you think there are going to be people in this world that's not going to have children that they're nursing and feeding and taking care of? Why, absolutely. So what is Jesus saying here and giving these? Well, look, flee to Judea, flee to the other side of the mountains. Get away from here, because if you don't, they're going to pursue you, they're going to kill you. If you're out on the housetop where you flat houses are and you're up there resting and you see this, don't go down and try to get any of your possessions. You go right then and there. There's your opportunity. Don't miss that. You know, sometimes people run back in a burning house to try to get something that they figure is precious to them and ends up losing their life. Well, that's the same thing that Jesus is saying about these. Pray that your flight be not in the winter. Why? Would you hate to have to run from your house to get away, not being able to take clothes or anything? How would you manage in the winter? You think about that? Then he says, look, pray that it be not on the Sabbath. Why not on the Sabbath? Because on the Sabbath, the gates to the city was closed. You was neither allowed in or out. So if it happened on the Sabbath, you would be closed in there. But if it's talking about the end of time, why would it matter whether it be one day or the other? Why would it matter? You see, it wouldn't matter. So these verses is not talking about the end of time. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he's telling... Now look at verse 22 there, if you can find it right fast, down there just about midways. Now he says, except those days be shortened, there shall no flesh be saved. Now wait a minute. My understanding at the end of time, there shall be no more time. And if there shall be no more time, there can't be any more days, can there? You got to have time to have days. It is time that makes days and nights. It is time that makes seasons. And without time, there's no such thing. So he's talking about those days. What are those days? They are those days in which the soldiers was going to surround Jerusalem and really bear down on. Do you know by history that there was 1.1 million Jews that died and hundreds of thousands taken into captivity? Think about that. Think about that. Historian says that it was so bad that people were eating their own children. Can you imagine it? And that's why Jesus said, you have never seen a time like this, or never will be. These people were eating their own children. Could you imagine? Now, I'm going to make this sort of grossly. Could you imagine, here you got a child here, 5 or 6 year old, and you're going to kill it and eat it? Maybe an infant, you're going to kill it and eat it? You just think about that. These are the days, and we'll point out here in a little bit something about these days. Now, this is what Jesus said. Then he talks about if there comes anybody now here that's saying Christ is here, Lord, Christ is there, and over here. He said, believe them not, because you're going to have these false preachers or false prophets running around saying Christ is going to save us, Christ is going to save us. He said, don't believe that. You've had your warning. You failed to heed your warning, and this is what's going to befall you. Now he says, behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, Christ is over here, he says, don't believe that. He said, I've already told you. I have forewarned you. Now, when you look at these verses, falling right after what we just talked about in chapter 14 and then verse 15, you see that these verses fit very well with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, we want to look at Luke here and see what Luke says. And when he was come near, he behold the city. Now, this is just before we get to the fact that he's going to talk about the destruction of it. And here's what Jesus had to do with it. He behold the city and wept over it. Wonder why Jesus was weeping over that city. Because Jesus could already see and foreknow what was going to happen to this people. People that he loved. People that he come here to seek and to save, and yet they rejected. And yet he shows his love in this, saying, if thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thy eyes. What was Jesus talking about when he said the things which belong to thy peace? The gospel belonged to the Jews. That's why Jesus come to his own. That's why that even in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 24, that she would bring forth the Son and he would save his people, the Jews, from their sin. There was their peace. If they'd only knew it, if they'd only accepted that. For the day shall come upon thee, that thy enemy shall cast a torch or trench about thee, and compass thee around, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knowest not the time of thy visitation. In other words, they just didn't know. They didn't want to know. They just rejected Jesus, and this is it. But look what Jesus is saying about it. They're going to dig a trench around you. You're not going to be able to escape this. You're not going to get up. Now, he talks about the days being shortened. Now, what was he talking about? Well, he shortened those days for the elect's sake. Because he said if he didn't do that, then they would be none of them that would be saved. Now, this historian that we was sort of quoting from, he is talking about this, and here's what he says about it. By August of AD 70, 1.1 million Jews had fallen by the sword, and of the sword, and 100,000 had been led away captive unto all nations. The high percentage of the city's population was exterminated and enslaved during the fall of it. Can't you see that what Jesus offered them, and he said, look, you have passed that by. Now Matthew, when Jesus looks upon this city, he weeps over this city and said, oh, how often would I have taken you under my wing, and you would not. That's what he's talking about here. You have lost the things that has belonged to you that would bring you peace and keep you safe. You have rejected it. And because of that, God has rejected you. That's what Luke is saying about it. Now, let's look at verse 27 to 28 of Matthew 24. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there the eagle will be gathered together. Now we look at that, and again, I could say, look, this is prophetic language that Jesus used, and you could apply this to the end of time. But the thing of it is that when Jesus comes, he's going to be on the clouds, and he says, every eye shall see him. Well, here he says that like the lightning is that comes out of the east and shineth to the west. Well, it can lightning from other places, and we never see that. We would never see that, or we'd never know that. So what is Jesus talking about here? Well, again, when you go back, when you see that abomination standing in the holy place, where it ought not to be, that's the Roman soldier. Remember the wings? What was that? That was eagle's wings. So he's saying here, wherever the carcass is, there will be the eagle. Or there the eagles will be gathered together. Well, who was gathered together against Jerusalem? It was the Roman soldiers. So when you see the eagles, there's going to be the carcass. And that carcass was going to be the Jewish state. How was it a carcass now? Well, because God had turned it over. God had said, hey, I'm done with you. You have rejected my son. Jesus gave many parables about that. He would talk about one parable where God sent the prophets, they killed them. Then the father sent his son, and they did likewise to the son. They killed him. So Jesus is just foretelling them what they were going to do. Well, again here, where the eagle's going to be, there the carcass would be. Look at what Mark says, 13 and 20, same story. And then shall they see the Son of Man come in clouds with great power and glory. Now, what Mark is saying here is that Jesus' judgment, God's judgment, is coming upon these people. And you're going to see this coming. Now, according to history about the Roman soldiers, they come out of the east and went westward with it. That's how they did it. So if that's what Jesus is talking about, that could be. But I understand this to be that he was sending this army to conquer them. Now, I want to show you some language from the Old Testament that shows this to be true. Look at Isaiah chapter 19. Here's talking about Egypt. He said, the burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. Here was God placing a judgment upon Egypt, and that's exactly what happened. But God didn't literally ride in there on a cloud. But he did send his power upon them as though it rode on a swift cloud. Well, that's what Jesus is saying about himself. That his judgment, that his prophecy upon Israel was going to be like the lightning. It's going to be very swiftly. That's why the days were shortened. That's why it was swift. Because God didn't want to destroy every one of them. That's what that was about. Again, think about it like this. when you look at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29 through 31. Now, here it picks up after Jesus talks about that, and here's some other verses that you need to think about. And immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the power of heaven shall be shaken. Then shall appear the signs of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. Now I'm going to stop right there just for a minute. After this tribulation, after what tribulation? What has just happened as Jesus has told them? The temple, the Roman soldiers has moved in. They have destroyed it. They have leveled it to the ground. They have just absolutely ruined it. Now he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, after this happens, after the temple falls and Israel is all busted up, millions killed, at least 1 million of them, 100,000 taken off, he said, after this happens, then in those days, the sun shall darken. What is he talking about there? The religion, the Jewish church, as we'll call it, the temple, that once shined as a beacon among all the Jews, and a matter of fact, among the world, that this was God's people, enlightened with God's word, who shined as a light. It's now gone out. That's what he's talking about. Just like we, as Jesus says, we are the light of the world. But you know, we live our life in a way that our life is out. Jesus told the church in Revelation that either they straighten up or he would remove the candlestick. In other words, their light would go out. Well, this is what happened. This is what happened to the Jewish state. Their sun, their religious rituals and everything that they did, it's destroyed. Now we know that Jesus nailed it to his cross. But that job was not completely finished till he destroyed this temple. And the idea of that was this, and you think about it, was that these Jews hindered the church. They were the ones that was giving Paul orders, giving him letters, helping him crucify the church. They needed to be moved out of the way to make room to let the church expand and grow like God wanted it to do, and that's exactly what God did. He said, the moon shall not give her light. Well, what would be the moon in it? Well, we could look at that and say, well, that could be the priest doing the priestly jobs. Shall not give their life. That's going to be done away with. The stars shall fall from heaven. Well, there's two ways to look at that. You could bring that back to the priest or back to their government. If the light would be the church, the sun, then the moon could be the government, and the stars could be the priest and those people doing the work. He says, shall fall from heaven. Well, now we know that when Jerusalem fell, it didn't fall from heaven, it fell on earth. But what happened? They had lost their position in heaven with God. That's what that's talking about. And the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Maybe the powers of heaven would be shaken in a good way, because without these Jewish people having this authority and being in this position, this freed up the children of God to take the gospel out into the world and stop the persecution for a good while. And then shall appear the signs of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. Now, what was the sign of the Son of Man in heaven? Well, Jesus said while on this earth, Jerusalem is going to fall. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be leveled. When that happened, there was the sign, or there was the fulfillment. Now, remember again that Jesus said about this, that heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not. Jesus is saying very clearly that it is impossible that God would allow the heaven to be destroyed. He would allow the earth to pass away. He'd allow heaven to pass away. But what Jesus has said about Jerusalem would come to pass. So when you look at this and it says, and there appears the Son, the power of the Son of Man. When Israel flops and everything falls, there was the appearance of what Jesus had said. It had come to pass. Now, again, going on in sin, he says that he's come in the clouds with power and great glory. Now, remember, we just read back in Isaiah the 19th chapter about what it said about Babylon, or rather Egypt. And there he rode upon a cloud with swift judgment coming to them. Now, some commentaries, they are in disagreement here. The word immediately shows that our Lord is speaking about something that is going to take place very quickly. It's going to be very quickly. And that was with Jerusalem. And you just think about 40 years or so, a little longer, this happened. Well, at least about 70, we say. This happened. But something immediately means that it's going to happen real fast. Now he goes on. And ye shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now again, I believe what this is saying is that the gospel was going to be spread, that the people could go out here and gather them in from every direction. No more hindrance from the temple and the Jews and the priests and the synagogues of the, and I'm trying to think of the 70 men, Sanhedrin court and things like this, because it don't exist no more. So now they got freedom to go everywhere. Now look at Isaiah again. We're going to talk about Babylon and show you that Babylon goes right along with what we've just read. In Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Verse 10, for the stars of heaven and the constellation thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in the going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. You see, there's the same thing that Jesus is saying. This was talking about Babylon, this great nation Babylon, that it was going to fall, that God was going to put its lights out. So that's what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about this. He's talking about putting the lights out of this famous place that God once loved, that was once God's people, will be no longer. Look at verse 17. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regret or regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. What does God say? I'm going to stir these Medes up against them. I'm going to send the Medes in on them. And the Medes is going to conquer them, and they're not going to regard the silver and gold, that stuff that they got. They're going to be conquered. They're going to be brought down, and they're going to really be snuffed out just like you would reach over and blow a candle out. That's what he's talking about. This great empire, Babylon, was going to be put out. Why? Because God chose to put it out. That's why it's going to be put out. Why was Israel and the temple and their form of religion put out? Because they had rejected God, rejected what God had for them, and God said, because of that, you're going to be snuffed out too. And God used the Romans just like here he used the Medes. So you see, it's all the work of God to destroy Jerusalem. Think about it. Look at Ezra here, chapter 32 and verse 7. And when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heavens and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. Here he's talking about Pharaoh, the great king of Egypt. He's telling Pharaoh what he's going to do to him and his empire. Why? Because Pharaoh rejects God. And God said, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to bring you down. Listen, When God moves to bring down a nation, I don't care what nation you are, you're going to be brought down. If God decides to put you out, you're going to be put out. So we need to be careful. Now I want you to think about this. Look at verse 32 through 34 here, 35. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When the branches is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Now here's the catch. All that Jesus has talked about down to here, Jesus had said it must come to pass. All right? If it must come to pass, when will it come to pass? Is this talking about in the days that we live? Is it talking about in the days to come? Or is it talking about days back there? Look at the next verse here. Verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Jesus is saying everything that I have said to you about Jerusalem and what's going to happen from the very beginning is going to come to pass in this generation. Now we know by AD 70 that Jerusalem fell. They were going to be people that Jesus was talking to that was going to live through that, or they were going to die in it. But he does say that these things that I have said to you, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. So if Jesus says, look, this belongs to our day and time, when Jesus walked on this earth, how can man take these things and apply them to our day and time or to somewhere in the future? These are men who think that they can figure out things that even the angels don't know. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Jesus is saying, and it would be like we're saying to you, what I've spoke to you is the truth. And it cannot be changed. This is what Jesus is saying. He said this is fixed in heaven. It cannot be changed. It cannot be changed to a later date, because he says it's going to happen in their generation. Not our generation, but in their generation. But yet you got these people that says, look, this is talking about the time of the end of the world, and in this you're going to find the rapture now. You're going to find the rapture. We just got a few more slides to go. We're going to run over, but we got to finish. Matthew chapter 24, verse 36 through 39. Now, he's going to switch here to answer the third and final question. The end of time. Now, I want you to think about this and look at this. But of that day and hour knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. How was it? Well, he said they was eating and drinking, giving in marriage, going about everyday life's business. And they didn't know that till verse 39 says, until the flood came and took them away. So shall it be, or so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now you say, well, that sounds pretty similar to what we've already went over. Well, it does. But I want you to notice one thing that the Bible points out that sometimes we don't pay attention to. If you got your Bible handy, back up to verse 22 in Matthew. And what we're going to do, we're going to read a verse here, and I think this verse helps us to understand about what Jesus has switched off to here. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 32, it says, except these days be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, these days shall be shortened. You see the picture? Jesus is talking about those days. Now, what does those days imply? Not a single day, but a duration of time during days. Those days. But here in 36 down through 39, he changes that. But of that day and hour. Now you remember they asked him, when will the end of time be? When will the end of ages be? When will the end of age be? Jesus said, for that you don't need to know. Well, you want to say, well, why couldn't Jesus tell them that? Well, there was a reason why. There was a reason why that Jesus couldn't tell them that. The fact that it was is that Jesus himself didn't know. But I want you to notice some similar verses to this that actually talk about the end of time. Look at 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. But of the day of the Lord, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth also and the works therein shall be burned up. Now wait a minute, that's referred to as the day, not those days, but the day. That's a single day. That's the day when Jesus comes to pass judgment and the end of time. So what he does, I think, in 36 here, he switches to answer that third question. Now he's talking about a specific day, not those days, not in the days of the destroying of Israel, the temple and stuff in Jerusalem. He's not talking about those days, but he's talking about a specific day. Now, you could say, well, he's talking about the Pacific day that they would... No, there wasn't no Pacific day there. This was a succession of time. Soldiers had to surround it. Soldiers had to get in it. Soldiers had to burn it. They had to loot it. This probably went on for a good span of time. But like God said, he shortened those days. Because if he didn't, he said there'd be no flesh saved. So he shortened those days. But now he's talking about a day. And he says, knows no man. Now Revelation says, behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keep his garment, lest walking naked, and they see his shame. Here's two scriptures that goes along with Jesus. Now, when you think about that, Thessalonians chapter 2 does the same thing. It talks about the day of the Lord, not the days, but the day of the Lord. And it's talking about when the Lord shall come. Again, when we start looking now, getting ready for that day, that particular day, here Jesus starts giving us some warnings that we should do. Then shall two be in the field, the one taken. Now here's where everybody says this is the rapture, when the rapture takes place. No, but what this is just simply talking about a separation. It's just simply talking about when God comes to place judgment that people are going to be separated. You remember Jesus said it himself. He said that he is like a shepherd and he'll set the goats on the left hand and the sheep on the right hand. That's simply all this is talking about. One be left and one taken. Like that. That's all the thing that he's talking about. Here's what he's wanting you to see and what we need to see here. As he talks about these, grinding at the mill, one taken, one left. Now here's the point. As he tells them this, because they're going to come a separation, he says, now, therefore, he says, you need to understand this. In verse 42, watch, therefore, for ye know not what the hour your Lord cometh. We don't know. We don't know when he's going to come. But he said this one thing we would, if we know when the good man of the house, let me get back up here. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye ready, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes, or cometh. So here is Jesus throughout the rest of the chapter is just giving us a warning about the day that we don't know nothing about. And if you go over and read Mark's statement on that verse, Mark adds that not even the Son of Man knows that. And that's another point I'd like to make to you tonight. Why would people, when the Word of God says angels don't know, even the Son don't know, only God knows, why would people try to sit with their feeble minds and try to read God's mind so that they can tell people that Jesus is going to end the world at a certain time? And yet they have missed it from the beginning to the end. As we said this morning, 165 since AD 66 to 2017, and every one of them has missed it. He goes on here, verse 45-50. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord will make ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Now, Jerusalem's gone. Everything's gone. Nobody to stand in the way. Now, who is Jesus going to put in charge now? And who's going to give the church meat and stuff to eat? Well, you're going to have the elders doing it. You're going to have the deacons doing it. You're going to have the preachers doing it. You're going to have those Christians doing it. And they're going to do it without any hindrance. That's what he's talking about. He'll make them ruler. But yet he talks about this foolish servant on down here who thinks his Lord's going to delay, and then he starts punishing and mistreating his brother. The Bible there says when he comes, he'll cut him under and he'll get the right just for that. Now, that's the end of Matthew 24. Matthew 25 picks up with some of the same idea. He talks about 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 foolish. When they go out to meet the bridegroom, they take their lambs. But yet when they get there, the bridegroom tarries, they lay down and they slumber, they wake up. One is ready because they got the oil and the other is not. Why? They didn't watch. They didn't prepare. Jesus gives another parable about the talent men. 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. We know there that after that, the 5 talent man, he doubled his, and the 2 talent man doubled his, and the 1 talent man hides his. He didn't try to prepare. So Jesus is trying to warn us, prepare for the coming of the Son of Man. At that day. Not those days, but at that day. And that day is talking about judgment. It's talking about the last day. Those days back over here deals with the fact of the destruction of Jerusalem and all that would take place there. My friends, he does answer 3 questions there. Now, are we going to have a rapture where one's taken and one's left? No. No. He's just talking about a judgment that is going to separate people. That's what he's talking about. If people would learn that and quit their foolishness about trying to predict when the world is going to end and just prepare their life for the meeting of the Lord, it wouldn't matter if it come today or tomorrow. You would be ready. That's the thing. That's the thing about it. Only God knows that, and when man realizes that, they'll do better. If you're here and you could use the assistance of the church, we stand ready to help you in any way that we can as together we stand and sing.